Hello everyone, welcome to Diplomatic Briefing. Ministry of Natural Resources released bilingual report on Sino-British goodwill, criticizing US concept of freedom of navigation lacking international legal basis and accusing using military force to threaten regional peace and stability, disrupting international maritime order. On August 25th, Institute of Marine Development Strategy Ministry of Natural Resources released Chinese and English versions legal assessment report on US model of freedom of navigation. The report examines if U.S. claims and practices on freedom of navigation align with international treaties and general international law. It also assesses whether these actions have a legal basis. The report reviews the U.S. legal position and practices on freedom of navigation, especially statements and actions related to its freedom of navigation program, focusing on issues such as innocent passage of warships, entry for assistance, transit passage, archipelagic sea lanes passage, international waters, legal status of islands, exclusive economic zones, military activities, air defense identification zones, and historic waters. The report summarizes the U.S. claims, characteristics, and influence regarding so-called freedom of navigation. This report is divided into 4 parts. The first part briefly outlines the overall U.S. position on freedom of navigation and its actions, summarizing the main legal viewpoints of the U.S. regarding freedom of navigation. The second part analyzes the U.S. understanding and related practices concerning navigation rights, as well as the gaps between these and other international law rules. The third part addresses the legitimacy of U.S. restrictions on the rights of coastal states, discussing whether these have a sufficient basis in international law. The fourth part assesses U.S. freedom of navigation from legitimacy and rationality perspectives. The report points out that the American concept of freedom of navigation contains self-invented concepts and so-called customary international law and international law based on self-imposed standards, which often conflict with many other countries' practices. By relying on these claims and actions, the United States does everything it can to restrict the legitimate rights and interests of other countries, expand its own rights and freedoms, and obtain unrestrained freedom beyond the bounds of law. The report states that the American approach to freedom of navigation lacks a basis in international law, seriously distorts the interpretation and development of international law, perpetuates the logic of gunboat diplomacy and power politics, and reflects the United States' habitual use of military force to pressure other countries. The American version of freedom of navigation serves the national interests and geopolitical strategy of the United States and is suspected of using military force to threaten regional peace and stability, disrupt the international maritime order, and is marked by clear illegality, irrationality, and double standards. In addition to exposing what lies behind the so-called American freedom of navigation, namely using the banner of freedom to actually contain China and create tension in the Asia-Pacific region, the report also reveals these intentions. To put it bluntly, it's about stirring up trouble around China, making sure China can't have peace, forcing it to expend diplomatic resources, and attempting to slow down China's development. However, as the United States has increasingly turned toward protectionism in its trade activities in recent years, China's manufacturing industry has soared. Coupled with enormous domestic market demand, China has gradually replaced the US as the main player in global trade and has become the largest trading partner for many countries and regions. So far, China has become one of the top 3 trading partners for 157 countries or regions. Being among the top 3 trading partners means that China and these countries or regions have deeply intertwined relationships. If the US relies on power politics and bullying, coercing other countries to weaken China's influence, it may not achieve its goals. Take Africa as an example. In recent years, the US has been very active trying to counterbalance China. However, some foreign media have analyzed and found that China's deep-rooted presence in Africa is hard to shake. During the Biden administration, the United States vigorously promoted the Lobito Corridor Railway project in Africa, seeing it as a beacon of hope and hoping to use it to counter China's influence in the region. This project involves restoring the 300-kilometer railway from Angola's Lobito port to Luau on the border with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, aiming to create a key trade route for minerals. However, according to a report by the South China Morning Post on August 23, Kun He, the CEO of Lobito Atlantic Railway, LAR, the company responsible for maintaining and operating this railway project, said that they are a purely commercial entity with no geopolitical considerations and that they are independent from Chinese enterprises. In an interview with the South China Morning Post, Cunha said that their company aims to promote economic activity along the railway route. According to him, LAR has close business ties with Chinese companies, serving as an important logistics provider for Chinese mining companies in the DRC, and also relies on equipment manufactured in China. He pointed out in the interview, "We are part of this corridor, but we are just one component. We handle the logistics, operating the railway and the port, and there are absolutely no geopolitical factors involved." Cunha emphasized the company's close business relationship with China. He pointed out that in the DRC, 8 Chinese mining companies are their main clients, and most of the copper ore transported by these Chinese companies is shipped to Chinese ports. He also mentioned that the sulfur imported through Lobito port and the railway is sold to Chinese smelters, scrap processors, and electrolytic refineries in the DRC. He also mentioned that LAR purchased 1,570 containers from China for rail transport, and all of the containers have already arrived locally. In addition, the company signed a contract with CRRC Group to purchase 275 rail cars from China, of which 100 have already arrived in Lobito. Looking back at the information, LAR is a joint venture supported by European companies with shareholders including the global commodity trader Trafigura, the Portuguese construction group Motor Engel, and the Belgian railway operator Vecturis. According to the data, China Communications Construction Company holds a 32.4% stake in Motor Engel, thereby indirectly holding shares in the LAR consortium. In 2022, their company obtained a 30-year concession to modernize, maintain, and operate this 1,300-kilometer railway, including the dedicated mineral terminal at Lobito Port. Cunha said that LAR is entirely financed by shareholder equity and is currently in the final stages of securing over $500 million in loans from the Development Bank of Southern Africa and the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, which will be used for upgrading the Angolan section. He added that the company mainly maintains contact with the governments of Angola and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as well as European sponsors. The Lobito Corridor is a 300-kilometer railway that connects the Democratic Republic of the Congo, copper-rich Zambia, and Angola's Lobito port, aiming to become the next strategic economic corridor under the Biden administration's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment initiative. Former U.S. President Biden attached great importance to the construction of this railway, stating that this project is so far the largest U.S. railway investment in Africa. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, DFC, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, have both pledged to provide financial support. U.S. media have previously reported that the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment initiative aims to counter China's long-established and large-scale Belt and Road Initiative. And this railway is also aimed at China, with the goal of reducing the Western supply chain's dependence on China for key minerals such as cobalt and copper. When Biden visited Angola last year, he regarded this corridor as a successful example of U.S. investment, stating that the U.S. had already committed nearly $4 billion to the entire line, with an additional $600 million pledged. He also said that once the railway is operational, the time it takes for the DRC to transport copper ore to the United States via this railway will be reduced from the original 45 days to less than 45 hours. At the beginning of this year, when the Trump administration came to power, it temporarily introduced uncertainty to this project. However, the Trump administration has now pledged to continue advancing the development of the Lobito Corridor project. In December last year, Xinhua news agency cited analysis pointing out that the United States has been trying to package the Lobito Corridor as a contribution to African infrastructure, but due to the project's enormous costs and numerous challenges, whether it can proceed on schedule remains uncertain. A recent analysis article published by the United States Institute of Peace stated that the construction of the Lobito Corridor project faces many challenges, the most critical of which is proving the project's commercial viability. The South China Morning Post mentioned that no matter how the United States tries to package it, in reality, the Lobito Corridor is part of the competition for control over Central African mineral trade. Local scholars have pointed out that China has already secured a favorable position in this competition. Joseph, a law professor at the University of Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Chihonte said that the port of Lobito is the only fast route for key minerals mined in the Copper Belt region of the DRC and Zambia to be transported to the Atlantic Ocean. He said that China's investment in infrastructure construction in most East African countries has put it in a favorable position in the DRC's key mineral sector. Earlier, a spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that China would implement zero tariffs on 100% of taxable products from 53 African countries with diplomatic relations, providing greater convenience for exports from Africa's least developed countries to China. In July, several scholars from American think tanks and African universities analyzed that China's tariff exemption plan is a significant public relations victory. They believe this may further strengthen the relationship between China and African countries, with these nations increasingly viewing China as a reliable and beneficial partner. They bluntly stated that the Western way of governance no longer works, and Africans may be closing their doors to the United States. Scholars have also pointed out that America's influence in Africa is gradually being surpassed by China. China is implementing broad trade policies and engaging in economic exchanges with Africa. In contrast, the Trump administration is imposing tariffs on African countries, cutting aid and restricting visas. To put it simply, the United States no longer has fully controllable operating companies in Africa. Even the Lobito Corridor project, which relies on the Lobito Atlantic Railway Company for implementation, actually has Chinese capital indirectly holding shares. And if you want to do infrastructure projects in Africa, or anywhere in the world for that matter, from construction machinery to the building process itself, it's very difficult to exclude the participation of Chinese companies. Previously, for African infrastructure projects supported by the European Union, the main winning bidders were